It is wonderful Friday, July the 10th, 2020. We're in the second half of the year. I'm talking to somebody who I've wanted to talk to for a while. She's actually super smart, and she's actually somebody I've interviewed before, maybe 2 years ago. She's a PhD. She's honestly, I call her an expert on this field. I know she'll be humble and not necessarily say that. She'll always say there's something more to learn. But I think in particular, what the topic that we're going to be talking about today, which is this issue of church plants, I think that she's one of the few people who can really give a lot of insight into what that is. And for those of you who don't know, our particular host is going to explain what a church plant is, and a lot of ways and how they interact with the urban environment. And so I've been noticing church plants over the last few years when I moved back to Atlanta. I didn't really notice them in New York just because there's too many things going on. And so it was hard to notice, but I noticed so many new churches. They were kind of like cool. They were kind of hip. They didn't feel like regular church. And it was always something that was interesting to me. And I couldn't really put my finger on it until I actually met the person I'm talking to today, Dr. Jessica Barron, or Dr. J, or smart person on earth. So whatever you want to call her today. And so she's one of the few people who can articulate that. She's written a book about this in particular, and has years of study in this particular field. So I'm going to let Jessica introduce herself, and I think you guys are going to really love when she gets to start talking about things.
Cool. Thank you for that amazing introduction. I appreciate that. So my name is Dr. Jessica Barron. I'm a sociologist and demographer by training, and I now work for a Black-owned and Black-led consulting firm based out in DC. But I spent a lot of years, almost a decade, studying urban church movements. I think, the cornerstones and the pillars of American culture in a lot of ways are the city, race, and religion. And so I was really interested in how those three cornerstones interacted, particularly because we've seen such a resurgence of people moving back to downtown urban cores, whether it's through, opening up coffee shops, different organizations moving back to be kind of hip and urban, and also just younger folks leaving, suburban America and seeking something different. And so wanting to capture and understand those trends.
Right. And so you're really good at this. See, like you get it pretty fast. Okay. So I want to step back for a minute in particular. Sure. So what is the history of a church plant? Because I think a lot of people are still just this is probably the first time they've ever heard this before. So can you explain to people how we even got here in the first place?
Yeah. So I think church plants are something that are pretty exclusive to kind of evangelical or Christian types of denominations. There's definitely other, religious groups, but that's pretty much who's kind of propagated doing church planting. And church planting is seen by Christians as something that dates way back into, biblical times, with the idea of missions and missionaries. So leaving your current body, going out into the community and creating some kind of sustainable structure so people can learn about, these different religious, the Bible, Jesus, all those kinds of things. So in modern day kind of Christianity, a lot of churches are starting to do and have been doing probably in the last maybe 20 to 30 years. If you think about like franchises, like fast food franchises, right? So certain types of churches and denominations have different ways in which they plant churches. So some of them are like franchises where you have your own church that might have, say there's a popular one, Calvary Chapel. So you might have Calvary Chapel, name your city. So Calvary Chapel, Pasadena, Calvary Chapel, Los Angeles. I'm from LA, so that's why I'm using LA City.
Okay.
Right. So, and you have your own government structure within those, meaning you can run the church the way that you want to run it. However, it's still attached to the, Calvary Chapel body, right? Then the other way is kind of these larger churches have what they call satellite campuses. And so their church has overgrown. And so they have these other campuses in different cities where they either live stream the church, or it's essentially going to that church, but in your city just because you didn't have enough space for that church to exist altogether. And then there's this idea of like a parent church where the church resources a smaller church to start, typically in an urban setting or other parts of the city, which they haven't had a large kind of presence before. And they give you resources, they give the entire staff goes over there, and then that's kind of how you start. I think the important notion behind all of this is that there is still this very particular idea that we are going into places where either they believe God or the Spirit is not involved and they have to do that. So there is still a evangelism kind of missionary type of association, and in some ways paternalistic, right? Like these communities can't save themselves, so we have to come in and save them. So those are some of the kind of history, the quick and dirty history and kind of structures of church planting. And I think it's important and interesting because I think what we're going to get into is that a lot of churches are starting to plant within parts of the city and parts of communities that they're not familiar with, right? The majority of these church plants are white churches, setting up in what I call like, unfamiliar environments, i.e., urban settings.
Yeah.
And they, get their one Black pastor or, one whomever to kind of be a part. And those are interesting dynamics. And we're not just seeing those in churches, right? Like we can utilize this model and see how different organizations are doing that throughout, right? With their franchises or trying to move into city centers to capture a type of population and experience.
Okay. Well, you're really good at this. You realize you just hit like 3 of my questions at once. So this is what, right. But no, okay. So I want to actually go back for a minute, which is sure. You talked about this notion of evangelicalism. And so for people at home who don't, a few people who do listen, I promise you they've never been to a church before. So what does that even mean? Like the evangelical movement or to be evangelical?
Yeah. So I think evangelicalism comes from the idea of evangelism. And so it is less traditional than what you might understand maybe from a Baptist or a Methodist denomination, simply meaning that their main goal is to reach as many people with this message and get people as far reaching as possible, and to do it in a way that is kind of more relational and individualistic. And so for evangelicals, that's what you're kind of seeing this, the modern day Republican Party, a lot of evangelicals are affiliated with that. I think the cornerstones, they might not say, but of evangelical churches is hyper individualism, right? You work hard, it is up to you, God rewards that. And so you see this kind of, I guess, like, how do I put this? You see this connection between, a lot of times between whiteness, evangelicalism, and then large scale churches, right? The need to kind of have this bigger, better model.
Okay. Okay. And so that was actually one of the things that I was going to bring up, and I didn't know necessarily how to bring that up, which was, in particular, there was something I noticed about those particular churches, and this is not necessarily an indictment of anything, but it did feel very, and in my mind, I always call it like American church. Like it felt very much like me, self, I, kind of like that dynamic of it. And I'm glad you articulated much better than I could. And so with that said, like, how does that translate into like the world of church planting it as we know it today?
Yeah, I mean, a part of church planting is a business, right? And you're going to put your best business person out there, right? And so a lot of these pastors are typically who are the heads of the church. So you can kind of look at them as like executive directors or CEOs, right? And so they're typically a lot more persuasive, charismatic. There's a charismatic leader that's there to draw everyone. I think what's interesting about church plants, and what's important to note too, is that, a lot of pastors aren't, they don't go through a lot of the same type of degree programs as you might think of, like an MBA, or they get, master's degrees or these kinds of things. A lot of pastors, it is okay to have, a high school education, or have gone to a Christian university or what have you, and that to be your training. And so it's really interesting to see these churches grow in such a huge way when they traditionally don't have this training, right? That we see as a part of like a growth model. But yeah, so I'm losing my train of thought in the question that you actually asked me, but I'm like going off on all the tangents. But yeah, so that I'll stop there and let you ask a follow-up.
Oh, no. Listen, you were doing good on that one. And I want to ask though, in particular, let's follow that tangent for a second, because I think for a lot of people in particular, something you bring up, and I've heard you mention this before, but this notion of like training and certification, can you kind of explain how that works with like and I apologize if I say this wrong, Jessica, just like churching in general, or like pastoring?
Yeah, so it really depends upon the denomination and what they require, but churches are typically very insular. And so they want you to go through their seminaries or their divinity schools, or they want you to go through their credential programs that might not be programs that are seen in higher education and acknowledged as, traditionally accepted types of certifications. And so for some, particularly for the evangelical tradition, it's really interesting because it is kind of the least um, it has the least constraints in terms of the hierarchy of how it's built up, right? So a lot of other, such as Methodist or Baptist, they have a board and they have, a convention where they all go and you have to be it's very hierarchical, and evangelicals are a little bit loose in that. And so one pastor can kind of have his own world and not really report to anyone else. And so because of that, there's different types of requirements. And so, but it's very rare you're going to see any church require somebody to have, a master's from Emory or a PhD from Pitt or anything like that. And in some ways that's almost seen as the enemy, or,
Oh, okay.
you are overly intellectual and so you're not as spiritual and you can't really connect. And that goes back to, which is a whole nother topic of kind of the war on science for churches in particular. But yeah, so I think back to what we were saying even before, this hyper individualistic model. So you have one person almost pioneering the way, and it's almost seen as the frontier, planting these churches, and then they are responsible for the growth with some resources from the church. But then that really pulls onto the hyper individualism of like, oh, they were able to plant. And then obviously it's always a backdrop of, well, the Lord gave them and this is their calling, and clearly the Lord blessed their efforts, and that is why they are so large.
Listen, this is why they pay you the big bucks. You hit a lot of things on the nail really fast. And so I want to ask in particular, the reason why we're even talking about church plants in particular is that I'm not going to mention this person's name, but he has done the podcast before. He's actually done it twice. And so we'll be talking soon. So this will actually be a primer into that episode in particular. But I bring him up in particular because he was a part of a church plant and he is no longer a part of this church plant now. And even before that, this notion of church plants, I saw more and more pop up throughout Atlanta. And it, like you said, it felt like a franchise. It felt like in places I had never seen a church, or a church that was really old and all of a sudden became like a new fresh coat of paint, a new demographic of people. And it felt like this was definitely not built for the native people of Atlanta. Not to say it was bad or anything. It just didn't feel like, for the 96-year-old or the 70-year-old grandmothers who go into church, this felt like very different. Mm-hmm. And so it brings me to something else I want to ask you about church plants in particular, which is, in Atlanta anyway, I'm not speaking about necessarily what you've been studying, but in Atlanta, a lot of the church plants follow paths of gentrification here. Mm-hmm. And in your studies, has that been something you've seen, or is that just something that may be just local to Atlanta?
Yeah, and I'm really happy you asked that question. And I'm sure any folks who are listening to this who know me well know that that's kind of been the second book that folks have really been asking me to write.
Oh, please do it. And I hope you do it. I really do.
I've been like, why is this following me around? So I should go back into so the reason why I got interested in this topic in particular is I'm originally a residential segregation scholar. And so understanding segregation and gentrification, those types of dynamics, particularly, how they play on generational oppression and different types of outcomes. And I think with urban churches, I was fascinated because, as you said, like this is a trend that you're seeing where these older buildings, particularly the study that I published my book on was a church that reformatted an older performing arts theater, right? And so it gives you this cool, interesting urban environment that takes away all of the piety of a church, so you can feel like you can really let your hair down and really kind of live your best life and not take all the ideals, that were maybe suppressing you at your old church and get to like live your city life in this church. And it was just extension of that. However, in doing that, there's still these very conservative ideals that churches have. And so that's where they bump their heads. However, you see these churches kind of accommodating and acquiring, old buildings and gentrifying them. And so this, I think, is an interesting trend. And I've even seen churches, Black churches, try to accommodate in which they no longer have large choirs. They now have bands, right? There's just 7 people. And so almost preparing for gentrification. And that was, this is so crazy because that was like the title that my publisher was throwing around. Like, we should call it Preparing for Gentrification.
That's actually good. That's the title. You need to go, you got to write this. Like, listen, people want this book to be written.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's fascinating. And I think, you know, whether you are religious or not, if you live in the US, you are touched by religion, religion shapes our political activity, our understanding of ourselves, our understanding of community, and even our professions, right? And so I have friends who've never entered into a church, but know a lot about churches just because they live in the US. And so we are missing out if we do not talk about churches in the larger landscape of all kinds of social issues, particularly gentrification. As you've said, like you've noticed in your city, I've noticed in LA, Chicago's where I did my study. You know, these churches are popping up everywhere, and they are bringing in residents who are not, as you said, native to, and so their dollars and their contribution in the way in which they see the city is very different, right? And in my book, I created this term called the racialized urban imaginary. And so the way in which different folks are bringing this framework into the city has a way in which they understand, you know, what a church for the city should look and feel like, and who should be included, and the ways in which people should be included. And in part, like we talked about before, when you're coming into an unfamiliar environment, you have these preconceived notions. You don't really have a lot of allies that you've already built up right in the community. You haven't asked the community, do you want or need this church? No one's really asked those questions. They've said, oh, we see in the city, which has always been, even regardless of churches, there's this notion that urban cities are like the place of like scary, and there's drugs everywhere, needles flying, and like everybody's having sex. And, you know, in the rural communities and in, you know, the frontier and in the suburbs, that's where people are calm and pious. And so we need to go into the city and change it. And that is always the posturing, versus the city is actually doing amazing, beautiful things. And it's been sustainable even before suburbs. And maybe they have something to teach you. And so there's a one-sided exchange, and that could be really damaging, you know, for the city in general.
I'm glad you said that, because one of the things I've noticed, and I haven't seen this necessarily come up as conflict yet with church plants in particular, but I have noticed this in particular where people know me as the guy who studies gentrification, and I'm always going to be that person. I'm okay with that. But these culture class that I'm seeing now in particular, as it relates to newer people moving into Atlanta, people who aren't even from the state of Georgia who are moving in and kind of changing things. Does that happen in the church, or is that just something that maybe these places are moving to gentrifying areas, and so these are overall conflicts of gentrification happening and the church just happens to be there?
I think that's a good question. I think that's like a chicken before the egg kind of question. And
Okay.
I don't think churches even see themselves as gentrifiers or the gentry, even though I noticed a lot of times the imaginary that folks would bring. And I say that not as like a child who has an imaginary friend, but, you know, imaginaries are really our frameworks that really dictate our actual behaviors and understanding of how the world works. And so these imaginaries that outsiders came with about the city of Chicago in particular, you know, they didn't see themselves as a part of the city, therefore not seeing themselves as a part of what was contributing to the city changing. The only part that they saw was we are contributing to what they hoped the hearts and minds of individuals, again, that individual effort. And for a lot of churches, although, you know, Christian churches in particular are very political in that they're very conservative, they would never see themselves as political and almost see gentrification as a political issue, and therefore we don't talk about it. However, you know, they very much talk about other issues such as abortion or gay marriage or those kinds of things. And those are, you know, they don't make the connection that those are still policy choices versus kind of, you know, sin and following God. And so in some ways, their framework to understand their presence in the city, there isn't a space for that discussion of residential segregation or, you know, gentrification.
Okay, that's interesting, because I would have figured. No, it does make sense. It's not what I was expecting to hear, but it does make sense. I always thought church was a place where people can speak openly, but when you frame it like that, I don't remember even when I was younger, churches talking about things like that.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I think is really interesting, and there was a New York Times article that was published a few years ago, because I talked to the author who reached out about this book in particular, but she was writing about this silent exodus, that she called it, of Black folks who entered into multiracial churches, which are typically these urban churches, and thinking it was this place where the church was rectifying its former sins of segregation within the congregations, right? White churches and Black churches. But then realizing how apolitical they were, and especially this was after the 2016 election, and so many Black congregates in particular in these, white multiracial churches, and I can get into what I mean by that in a little bit, but they felt really left behind by the congregation and not advocated for, and the fact that a lot of those folks voted for Trump. And for many, Black Americans, a vote for Trump meant a vote against, their safety and well-being. And so you saw this mass exodus of folks who had kind of bought into an evangelical ideal of how churches should be, and started either retreating back to their former, all Black congregations, or leaving the church completely because of, kind of finally being fed up with how apolitical the church claimed to be, but how it mobilized for white conservative politics.
Okay, if you don't mind, Jessica, I know we're supposed to be talking about church plants and gentrification, but can we, I know, give me 2 minutes. Can we just take like a detour? No, it's fine. I want to take this detour for a second. And I want to actually address it like this, which is, you mentioned that already about this schism, at least since 2016. Mm-hmm. What is going on with the church right now? Because the 4 years between 2016 and now is a very different world. And so how has church been as a overall function of society?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that's like a super hard and loaded question. I think, so prior to 2016, we had already seen this trend of, so I guess I'll take a step back, or in the early 2000s, churches all over came together for this racial reconciliation movement that was late 90s, early 2000, reconciling and asking for forgiveness for being such a huge part of the racial segregation of society, particularly the church. They always said the most segregated hour in America is 11 o'clock on Sunday, right? Interesting narrative. We can dissect that at another time and place. But so with that, though, came the idea of like, oh, the segregation was a sin, and using sin as kind of the bucket to put all this in, not policy, not our own beliefs, not, white supremacy culture, just sin. And so folks were able to get behind that. And again, this was individualistic, right? Individualistic efforts. And so the churches started then to create the remedy for that, which was multiracial churches. So we just need to all be together. And these multiracial churches, though, over 90% had a white pastor and mostly white leadership, Black singers, maybe one Black, associate pastor, but not a lot of folks of color who led these churches, right? And so then when 2016 happened, you got these churches who, are fairly liberal when it came to racial dynamics, right? All people should be together. We should fight for equality, but very conservative when it came to sexuality, abortion, the family unit, those kinds of things. And then 2016 happens, and folks of color in particular who've bought into these ideals and thought that their white brother and sister were right alongside of them, but then saw them, Trump get elected, that really shot to the heart of those who are immigrants in the church, those who are, Black, those who have, queer family, all this kind of stuff, right? And so right now, I think the church is in interesting and fractured places, right? You have those who are hunkering down that, Republicanism has been wrapped up in evangelicalism, so they're almost seen as one. So if you're going to call yourself a Christian, then you have to be a Republican. So there's those ideals. There's the fracture of the church has its next huge battle with reconciling with the queer population, right? So there's, and full disclosure, my younger sister is a queer pastor, and my dad is also a pastor, and it's great. They love each other, and they're, but our family's very rare in that. And so even my family has been excommunicated from churches because of our stance to allow my sister to be a pastor, and my dad to, support her. So you have a lot of these like fractures happening, and people really wanting the church to make stances against immigration policies, against these very visibly political issues. And churches have never had to be accountable in that way. There's been the quote unquote separation of church and state, which has never actually existed in the US. And so you just see, I think like the rest of the world, we're seeing a rumble, and who's going to come out on top, I think, is yet to be seen, right? One tactic that Christians utilize that they're still trying to is like a war on X. So like the war on the family, the war on Christianity. And if there's a war, there's an enemy, and the enemy then you have to fight, versus having empathy and really connecting with folks and listening about, what are those issues they're talking about. So you see a lot of that war on being built up. And I think that's what the Trump administration has been really smart in kind of fanning that flame, because Christians know that ideology, and they're able to kind of wrap around that, even if they don't actually believe in some of the, quote unquote, details of, this administration's ideals.
Right. And so before we get back on the main highway, there's one other detour I want to take. And this is, I just can't ask it without asking it. It's 2020, the second half of 2020. And unless anyone has lived under a rock, there's been a very large social movement that has been happening for the last 7 or 8 weeks now. And what started out with, and to be honest, like it's really been a decade of death, watching people being killed on cell phone cameras, on YouTube, on Instagram, has kind of boiled over this past, starting late May with the death of George Floyd, or the killing of George Floyd. And each and every day now, there's a new killing that comes out that's kind of more and more keeping this going. The protests, the people demanding change, people wanting justice. I just want to ask, like, how is the church reconciled with that, to the best of your knowledge, to where we are as a people right now?
Yeah, I mean, I've been talking to my other friends who are scholars and who are still kind of heavily into this work. And, they are pushing the churches to not say, oh, this was a terrible sin, but actually calling it for what it is: systemic racism, white supremacy, and utilizing those words. And so you do see some churches really, grabbing hold of that and doing some work, while others are, pulling way back and saying, well, we're not political, we don't get into political issues. And I think yet again, I think just like the rest of society, because we're so intertwined with race, religion, and identity in America, we're going to see this divide happening. And so I do see churches reading anti-racism literature and all out, hands on deck. And to be clear, there's a huge, I shouldn't say huge, there is a fraction of the church that is very liberal, moving very much towards a liberal ideology. There is liberation theology by Dr. Cohn and quite a few others that happened in the late 70s that people have really attached them to. There's a whole, queer movement of pastors in the Reformation Project, if you're interested in that. And so you see, these two divides, just kind of like society, the church is no different.
Okay. And so now getting back on the highway, I'm going to ask you an equally difficult question while we're back on the highway now, which is church plants. Like you told me before, a lot of this is based in the culture and the theology of evangelicalism, correct?
Correct.
And so I'm not going to lie, I got to ask this as well. Churches are in a lot of ways a business. And so you mentioned that sometimes these could be looked at as franchises. What is the business behind like having a church plant in the first place?
Sustainability.
Okay.
We definitely see, and this is a trend regardless of denomination, where folks are pretty active in church until they're about, 18 or so, drop off until they get married and have children, and then become a little bit more conservative and then remain in the church when they're older. And so, but with, the baby boomer Gen X population, we had, and this is my demographer hat, you have a very large segment of the population who is aging, and then a very large working population, right? And that working population was not going to church. They fell into that kind of 18 to 32-year-old kind of, and we're getting married later. We're also looking at different types of different structures of the family, different structures of relationship that were not traditional to the church. And so, having these church plants are a way to have this younger, hipper vibe, or a way to sustain and reach other constituents that weren't part of that main core in an effort to remain not only relevant, but actually in business. Also, churches, like a lot of other American institutions, are really big on more, bigger, right? And so look how big my church is. I have a satellite campus. We have 10 campuses. Congregants love talking about, how big their church is. We have to have 5 services. There's 1,500 people. That in all part of, people love their churches, right? And in many ways, churches almost encapsulate everyone's life. They play on the church softball team. They go to the church they go to Starbucks within the church, all those things. So for many people, this is their entire world. And so the fact that their world can get bigger and they can say, I'm a part of this, feels really good. And I know for those in my study, which is a church plant from a larger church right outside the city of Chicago, a lot of the Black congregants who went, particularly some of the Black men, were saying, in the rest of the world, no one would ever take my leadership seriously, or they wouldn't take my ideas seriously. But here I get to be at the front lines and at the, the very beginning of building something. I'm going to be a part of building this church, and it's going to be successful. And I could always say I was a part of it. And so they would also talk about their entrepreneurial dreams and how this was a part of an entrepreneurial type of dream that they always had, that they could now execute. And they are doing it, with a church, but they talked about, this is a business, we're a business. How much money are we getting from this church? Our leadership should be from here. I mean, they were talking about it in very kind of business-like terms. And so that's not a foreign idea. And I think a lot of churches understand that it's a business.
Okay. I'm glad you said that, because I just honestly find it fascinating in a lot of ways. I'm
glad you do. Some people are like, wait, what? It's a seed, it's a plant, does it grow?
You kind of walked me into my next question, which is, because a church is just that, it's a plant, right? So what causes a church plant to be successful or not successful, and at least in your study?
Yeah, I think in part, the success lies within the relationship between the funder, essentially, the parent church or the larger church organization. How much, is it really that this church is fairly independent in their leadership, or do they have to answer to the parent church like an actual child, or do they get some type of independence? When they have to answer like an actual child, you see a lot of friction. You see a lot of kind of paternalism in some way that doesn't allow the church to really expand and grow, meet the needs of the population in which they decided to address, right? And so a lot of these church plants are also fairly strategic in that, well, they're kind of strategic, right? There's these ideals or notions about an urban population or what goes on there. And they have a lot of interesting statistics they always quote. And I'm like, but where did you, I know you didn't get that from, the Urban Institute. I feel like you got it from somewhere, but this is what informs how they are going to set up the church. So the success really happens if these folks have enough leeway and enough room to adapt the church to the needs, but still have the resources from the parent organization to allow them to sustain their growth. Because typically, as we know with all new businesses, the first few years are really rough.
Right. Okay. I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the things a lot of people have, and I'm at least reading online about church plants, is that they feel as if, in particular with a church plant, that it's almost, some people, it's two things. So one of which is people who are traditional, they love church, they love the tradition of church, and who really, really kind of feel off-put about the notion of it not being like a traditional church, right? And then there's another group of people who seem to love it because it's not that traditional church. And so how does, in the case of this, if you're a business, how do you reconcile with those two different audiences, one who loves the traditional church and one who loves the untraditionalness of the church?
I think those people end up going to different kinds of plants. Okay. And some churches, they want to be, like the church that I did my study on, they wanted to be that unconventional church, almost as like a rebellion to the larger church. And there's other churches that believe in the traditional type of church setting, church values, and want to allow others to be able to experience that. And so they're going to plant a church in their community without asking them, and then, offer that traditional church experience.
Okay. And now I want to ask you in particular, the actual notion of like figuring out where to plant that church, who does that come from, and like how does that work?
Yeah, so it usually comes from the governing body of the church. So usually the head pastor, there's a typical like elders board or some type of governing board, which are typically mostly male, and they decide about, their growth model for however many years. And churches, a lot of times growth and being large is a sign of a blessing, and they can hearken back to the churches of Acts and other books of the Bible that talk about kind of this like evangelizing, and these large populations became aware of Jesus and those kinds of things. Again, I'm not a theologian, I'm a sociologist.
Right.
But these are the texts in which inform their understanding. And so in their minds, the bigger the better. The bigger means the more people are hearing about the gospel, and that is our ultimate goal. And so for some churches, it's about strategy. For others, it's about sustainability. And for others, it's about, function. We just got too big, and now we need to have more churches in other places. Or we have people driving from so far away to get to us. Let's just start a church within their city.
Got you. Okay. And so I just ask all that because a lot of times too, one of the things I noticed in particular in Atlanta is that a lot of these church plants are in places that, like I told you before, we're gentrifying, but these are places where I'm like, there's no way a new church or a new business can afford these rents of anything. Right. And I know the donations that they get on Sundays just could not be enough to facilitate that. It feels like you said, like it's, like a startup business.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this leads into even like the generational wealth gap, right? Most of these
Mm-hmm.
churches that are doing that are white churches with white
Mm-hmm.
leadership, and churches who have donors from the larger denomination that believe in this mission and have access to some resources and are able then. Now, a lot of pastors in these plant churches are not paid, at a living wage, or the church compensates them in that they usually get them a home. If their family's moving, they get their family a home, the family moves into that home, the church supplies all those things, right? So there is an added cost for the church. And they used to do this thing called the parachute model, where they would just like dump somebody in,
Mm-hmm.
and they'd have to figure it out within a certain amount of time. And then if not, they'd close down the church. So that model was obviously not super sustainable for a lot of churches, but churches are tax exempt. There's a lot of types of, incentives in some ways. And we have definitely seen the business aspect of churches. To think that churches are completely absent or absolved of the other types of social dynamics around, money and business is, it's a little naive to think that.
No, that's true. One thing you mentioned was the parachute model, and from my reading, I realized there was multiple types of models. Can you touch on like a few of those types of models of church plants? Because I think that people may be interested in that.
Yeah, and I might not have the most relevant terminology, because I know that churches have been trying to, change some of their terminology, as we all do, because words matter, and it might not, mean the same thing. So there was the parachute model that I believe they have moved away from, and that was kind of in the 80s and 90s. And then there was this kind of franchise model, which I actually don't think they call it a franchise model, but that's
Okay.
the way that's easiest for me to remember. But this idea of one larger governing body, and then essentially a church that functioned with almost all the same types of things, right? Same logo, same types of songs sung, same types of branding, but the pastor and the music might be a little bit different, but you can pretty much expect that in every single one, you're going to get the same types of orientations to Christ, orientations to communion, that kind of, you're not going to get like a wildly different service. Then there's the parent model, where they actually call it the mother-daughter model, which I think is really fascinating, since women don't have a really strong place in a lot of churches. That has changed a lot over time, but still, dominated by men. But it's the idea that there's a larger parent, and then they fund a smaller parent or a smaller church, the child going into whatever community, and they supply all the leadership and all the funding. So they're kind of beholden to that parent, right?
Gotcha.
And then the last one is the satellite model, where you have a church that opens up shop, but essentially they either have a pastor there or they have the church live stream their services. And so it feels like you're there. It's just that church got too big. There's not enough room. People don't feel like they have that real community. And so now they're going to do it in these smaller churches. There are home churches too, cells where people have church at their home. And those are sometimes seen, but as plants of these larger churches, as they're just trying to get set up and get involved in the community, they have these churches meet at their home so people feel comfortable. You know, they're new in their community and environment, and they're trying to build relationships.
Okay. And so I'm like, I could ask you 100,000 questions, but I want to take a pause for a second and actually get you to talk about your book in particular.
Okay.
Can you let people know what your book is, where they can find it, and what's it about?
Sure. The book is called The Urban Church Imagined, Race, Religion, and Authenticity in the City. And you can buy it on Amazon. The publisher is NYU Press. So I didn't self-publish. This is with a reputable university press. And it is based on a study that I conducted actually way back from 2008 to 2010. So and this is just a testament to academic research, how long it takes to actually get it to the people. But the book is essentially me really being interested in, and also just, you know, examining, you know, the urban environment and how it fosters like a particular expectation of racial diversity, really exposing then the utility of race and the fabrication of integration to create this like legitimacy in for a religious organization in a very unfamiliar environment. So for me, I saw that church leaders and congregants negotiated between this idea of, you know, or between their racialized urban imaginary of what a church in the city should look like, and the structures of inclusion and exclusion those different imaginaries created. And so for me, you know, the book focuses on like, you know, an evangelical congregation, but the larger premise is really to understand how these like traditional homogeneous organizations are really moving towards these increasingly diversifying city centers, and how they conceptualize race and inclusion within their organization. And so, yes, this is about a church, but you can also think about, you know, again, larger franchises and coffee shops, just outsiders moving into other communities without conversing with those communities first, and what dynamics those contribute to. So, and, you know, and I thought I also wanted to look at race, religion in the city, because as I said before, those are really the cornerstones of the American experience, and have a significant understanding in how we structure our lives politically, professionally, individually, and socially. So, yeah.
Okay. Once again, just where can they find that book at? Is it on Amazon?
Yeah, it's on Amazon now. You can find it at Amazon or NYU Press from the actual press, but it's cheaper on Amazon, so you can get it on Amazon. It's just been restocked, so it's available.
Oh, that's a nice little flex. Okay, yeah. That's a nice little flex.
About twice. It's, you know, was
even better
for Book of the Year for the National Religion Association and for the Social Scientific.
Oh, don't downplay that. Don't downplay that.
I also won Article of the Year for a chapter of the book by the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion. And the book's been cited widely both in academic circles and non-academic circles, which has been really cool. So I've been pleasantly surprised by this little gem that I, you know, just was interested in. So I am hoping that it is helpful and constructive in our understanding of, you know, the role that race and religion still play in American society. And like I said, I'm not a theologian. I'm not trying to, you know, purport anything or say one thing is good or not, but really understanding how these like social dynamics really shape our reality. We saw that the 2016 election, everybody said, oh, it was the rural community who voted in Trump. And I was like, it was not. It was white evangelicals. And that is really interesting and matters, you know, in how we understand the role of religion in politics.
Like, this is why, listen, that's why when you write the second book, I want to get like an autographed copy. Like you just went like a flex run for like a good 2 or 3 minutes. And so I respect it. Like, I just want you to be a little bit more bold about it. Say it with your chest.
Thank
Like,
you. Thank you.
you got championships on the wall. So I do want to ask you
Yeah.
one thing in particular before we
Hmm.
get out of here, closing out with church plants.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you one thing in particular. I for you guys who don't know, I sent Jessica probably a list of 24 questions, and I think she hit all of them in the first 6 minutes.
No way.
You did. It's
That list was epic. I was like, okay, all
Yeah, I
right.
did. I was honestly impressed. Like, she's putting up a Jordan level game today. She's on
Yeah.
it. So actually I want to ask a question that you didn't answer, but I want to ask you
Mhm.
now. I'm looking at it now, and it's you've kind of talked about it, but I just want to make clear what we talk about. So what is the pros and the cons of opening up a plant in the first place, especially the environment that we're in now? Like what is the pros and cons of just even opening up a plant?
Yeah, I think for the churches, like the pro is the ability for them ultimately, their calling as Christians is to evangelize. And so the pro is to be evangelists and to be able to reach what they perceive as corners of communities or society that aren't being reached, and or um, propagating their version of Christianity and making it available to those who may not be able to come all the way to their churches. um, I think the cons are like, and we do this as researchers, we do this all the time, where we enter into communities without asking anything. I've always been taught with my research questions, you ask the community first what questions they want answered. You don't come in with questions to answer for people who never asked you the question in the first place, right?
I
So
like that. Okay.
yeah, so I think the cons are, there is a lot of ignorance, and I know that's like a 4-letter word for a lot of people, but there's a lot of ignorance in a lot of these communities that they're entering into, and these presumptions about what happens and about the morality of the people within these communities, about assumptions about how people came to be in the situations that they are. There obviously is a lot of homophobia and sexism that are part of the church. And so that then is imprinted on their approach to the city and to these folks who have been living their lives, without these churches prior, and no one's asking them about their experiences. And the Bible is actually littered with and has over 500 verses on homeless and being there for those who are what they call the least of those who have been forgotten by society. And yet homeless youth, Black youth are the ones who are in the streets the most. And a lot of churches won't allow gay kids in any of their services, or in, if they sponsor homeless shelters, if you're queer, you're not allowed to use those shelters. And so there's just a lot of inconsistencies, right? We could go on and on and on.
Mm-hmm.
But again, if you're interested, the Reformation Project does a lot of great work around queer Christianity and supports and that kind of stuff. But yes, I think the cons are just entering into a place without having asked prior, and not from the other churches, but from the actual residents. What is it that you need and want in a church? One of the most prolific public gathering places in the US are congregations. We don't have like we're not in a shortage of congregations. We got a lot. So,
Right.
yeah.
Okay. This is the last question on the list, and you literally hit every single one of them. I want to ask you this particular. No, I want to ask, because you talk a lot about women and their role with churches. You talk about church plants. I'm going to ask you a silly question, but it was on the list. I'm going to ask you.
No silly questions.
There are silly people who ask questions, so I am that person.
This is true.
So, no. So this is a silly question, but do women have the opportunity to open up a church plant, or are women involved in the church planting process?
It really depends on the denomination and their view about women in leadership. So there definitely are some, for sure. I think Methodists do it pretty well. Lutherans do it pretty well. Yeah, there's different denominations that are very much women in leadership. There's a lot of co-pastor models now where it's
Okay.
a woman and a man who co-pastor together.
Okay.
That's a model my sister has with her co-pastor.
Okay. Shout out to
Also
your sister.
yeah, Beans, Barron, New Abbey in LA. Visit if you want.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so now, wrapping up, I do actually want to ask you one particular, I'm going to actually open up the floor for you. Is there something that you want people to know about you or your work that you think people should be aware of, or that you just want to like get it off your chest?
What a question. In a global pandemic and people finding out that racism is real, what do I want someone to know? I mean, yeah, so like I said, I'm a sociologist and demographer by training. And, you know, I believe in these tools to really help us to, you know, resurface the ways in which people are making meanings of the world and how that drastically shapes like the structures of inequality that we have. And so to start to sit and think that, you know, my one little action or the way I'm thinking about the world isn't connected, just trying to get people to see how connected we really are in an effort, because relationships and you know, familiarity like breed change. And so the more distance you have from something, the less likely you are to really care and to want to know. And so my, you know, a lot of the work I do and just my love of science in general is to try to be a part of the knowledge production of the world to help us understand and have a deeper appreciation and think critically about things. And so I guess my overall kind of, you know, motto and things I want folks to know is, one, everything is data. So take everything, learn from everything. And two, and I'm like trying to think of the best way to
Just
say
say
this.
it. Just say it with your chest.
It's like, you know, I mean, I'm really tired of ignorant people and please
Okay.
just Google shit. But also like, I mean, there's like what we are in the information age. Like the fact that you say you've never heard something, I'm like, that just, you just can't never have heard nothing. Like I can't, I'm tired. But also I think, I don't know. I mean, yeah, I'm like, let me not say anything wild and crazy.
Okay. Listen, this is your
It's
opportunity to say
Friday. It's
it is
like
Friday.
the
This is
end
the
of
perfect
the
time to say something
day.
wild though.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I'm rooting for everybody Black.
Okay.
I'm also like half Mexican. And so I'm here for the liberation of my people and all peoples in general. And, you know, without people who are most at the margins, without their voices leading in the center, we're never going to get anywhere. They have the best vantage point because they've been pushed out. So they have the farthest view of all the issues that are happening and they're closest to the solution. So if
I
we're
like that.
yeah, if we're not elevating those in the margins, we're never going to win.
I like that a lot. So, all right, we got to get out of here, but I want to tell you, how can people get in contact with Jessica?
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram, Dr. Jmob, and you can also email me, jbarron@frontlinesoul.com. That's my work email. That's probably too hard. jmbarron12@gmail.
Oh, we giving out real email addresses. Okay.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
I could always, you know, block you. No, I'm just kidding.
This is true. You could
Yeah.
flex.
But yeah, Instagram's like the easiest way. I just follow Twitter. I don't like really ever tweet. So that's
Don't
like,
get involved. It gets crazy.
yeah, I don't. So that's, you know, you can hit me up on Instagram. The organization, the firm I work for is Frontline Solutions. And so if you're interested in anything like that, you can hit me up there. But yeah, I'm appreciative of the conversation. I thank you so much for being interested in the work that I've done.
Always.
And also just this topic. It's super fascinating to me, and I hope other people found it fascinating.
Well, if they're listening, they find it fascinating in some regard. So I got one last question before we get out of here. One last one. What's making you happy?
Oh man, so I just bought a house.
Oh, nice. Even another flex. All
yeah.
right.
Being in your 30s, young, single Black woman, bought my own house. And so decorating has been really cool. I'm sitting in my egg chair now and just like putting the pieces that I want in my own home that I purchased for myself. You know, betting on yourself feels really good. So that's been fun. That's been making me happy.
All right. There you have it. Once again, this is King Williams. If you haven't realized already, listen to the Neighborhood Watch podcast. Please follow wherever you heard this podcast. If you heard it on SoundCloud, you heard it on Spotify, you heard it on YouTube, wherever, please like and review this as well. If you want to reach out to me, you can reach out to me on all social media channels. It's always at I am King Williams, no matter where you are. So at I am King Williams on all social media channels. If you want to as well, you can also sign up for my newsletter at iamkingwilliams.substack, substack.com. Again, I am kingwilliams.substack.com. And if you want to donate, you can donate at patreon.com/I am King Williams. Once again, thanks to Jessica for coming out. Y'all, she's a super smart person. Make sure you pick up her book. Make sure you follow her on Instagram. She has a lot of things to offer the world. And so once again, thank you all for tuning in. All right.